Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage Jennifer Lasseter, Executive Director of the Digital Dollar Project.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. It's so wonderful to see everybody here this morning. I had a great time at dinner last night, and thank you for being a part of creating that environment. I think we had a very provocative and hopefully widely discussed panel as we move in today from the dinner last night. And today is quite honestly my favorite day. I'm so excited to be here. Today is the second part of our programming where we really have hands-on technical experiences, and that's both through our FinTech Hub, which again is in the room right behind you, and in the workshops that we'll be facilitating in this room across this afternoon. So before we move into that phase, we have two very dynamic panel discussions to kick us off this morning. The first one is in conversation with the ECB and the Bank of Israel. The second one is in conversation with FinCEN, TRM Labs, and Stellar. So thank you for being here. Please make yourselves at home. We'll be getting up and moving around once we move into our tabletop discussion session. But to kick off for our next panel, I'll introduce someone who needs no introduction at this point, I think, my colleague Josh Lipski.
Thank you, Jen, and echoing that, so excited for day 2 workshop day, and what a conversation last night to set the frame and the stakes of what we're going to talk about today. And it is my pleasure, without further ado, to introduce Evelien Witlox, Program Director of Digital Euro Project, European Central Bank, and Yoav Sofer, Advisor to the Deputy Governor, Bank of Israel. Evelien, Yoav, thank you both for being with us. We truly appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So, Evelien, I'm going to start with you and jump right in. We had a fascinating day yesterday. Cecilia Skingsley from the BIS, Tobias Adrian from the IMF giving keynotes. We had Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Turkey, Hatice Karahan, talking about what they're doing on CBDCs. We talked multi-CBDC platforms. We talked wholesale. We talked retail. And the ECB's name was invoked frequently, as you can imagine, because there's so much interest in the digital euro. Now, I know that you've just come out of the 2-year investigation phase and you're moving into what you call the preparation phase. And I think what we would appreciate hearing from you to start is, what does that mean? What will the preparation phase look like? What are the benchmarks we should be looking to the ECB for in the coming months?
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking the question and being interested in the work that we are doing on the digital euro. So, as you said, we have finalized the investigation phase, which lasted 2 years. So we started October 2021, and we went to the Governing Council last month. And there, actually, we presented 2 things. So first, we presented design, so as far as we have it at this point in time, and we presented a plan for the next phase. And the next phase is again a 2-year phase, which is called the preparation phase, and we will further build on the work that we have done in the investigation phase. So what would it entail? So we want to further prepare to be as ready as possible for a potential decision to issue. The preparation phase will be conducted in parallel with the legislative process that is currently running in Europe. So the European Commission published a draft legislation on the digital euro just before the summer, so end of June. And then after the summer, the legislative process has started. We have always been very clear that the Governing Council would not consider taking a decision on issuing a digital euro before the legislation would be adopted. So this means that we will work in parallel. That will also mean that we stand ready to support the process with further technical expertise where needed. And of course, with the confirmation that whatever comes out of the legislative debate will of course be incorporated in the design of the digital euro. What will we do then in parallel to prepare ourselves to be as ready as possible? Because payment experts in the room would know that it's if you want to launch a digital currency, a payment method, this is not something you do within a week time. You need a lot of preparation for that. So a couple of core points that we were doing in the preparation phase would be to finalize the rulebook. So the scheme rulebook would provide the standards that would be there so that if a decision would be taken to issue, all parties know what they need to prepare with. So that is for the euro system itself, but also for the intermediaries and the merchants on the acceptance side. That's one. Secondly, we will start the sourcing of the elements that would be needed for the Eurosystem to provide the services that they will provide in the ecosystem. And those services are around issuance and settlement of the digital euro. And also this process will inform us on the technology choices that we will make in the end. And then we will further do more experimentation, and that would be more technical experimentation on one hand, but also further experimentation on user experience. And then last but not least, we will do a deep dive on some aspects of the digital euro, one of which is the financial stability and the modeling that we would put in place in order to, at one point in time, determine the holding limits, which is an element of the design of the digital euro.
Evelien, thank you. That's helpful and a useful roadmap for us over the next 2 years, and we'll continue to check in as progress develops. But you ended on financial stability, actually, which is what I wanted to ask you as a follow-up, because there's so much interest in CBDC caps. Bank runs, how CBDCs can affect commercial banking liabilities. We know from what we've seen from the ECB, it seems like 3,000 euros is the number that's being targeted as a cap. And if you could just explain to our group here how you arrive at that number, how you think about stability between the commercial banking sector and the central bank.
Thank you for asking this question, and let me clarify something. So we have not decided the level of the holding limit yet. So we have always said that it should be decided much closer to issuance, and one of the follow-up work we're going to do in the preparation phase is to look to what are the elements that you need to take in consideration when setting a holding limit, and how should you model for that. So, but then the 3,000 euros have been mentioned. That is based on studies that have been done by ECB experts, and that has shown that with a 3,000 holding cap, there would be no threat for the financial stability in Europe. Let me also flag that this study took into consideration quite, I would say, stiff assumptions. It will build on the assumption that every euro area citizen would have a digital euro, so even the people under 18. It would also entail that people will always hold their holding limit. So even if they have done one transaction, the moment they have done the transaction, they top up to have the full holding limit. So it's quite a stiff assumption. And then with that, the 3,000 was deemed to have no negative impact. As said, we will further work, and we also would look to further work with the industry on detailing out this further, and to be able to set a good holding limit that does not disrupt financial stability. Having said that, I think it's also important that when we look at that, and if I say we, it's not only the ECB, but in a broader sense, that we are aware that the digital euro is only one thing that is potentially going to be introduced. While we know there are much more elements that will impact the liquidity position of the banks potentially. And we believe actually that in the end, the digital euro would really be of benefit for whole society, including the intermediaries.
And Evelien, when you're talking about other things that will be introduced, are you thinking stable coins, cryptocurrencies? Is that what you're referencing, other digital assets?
Amongst others, that's one. It could also be other central bank digital currencies. But we could also see, if you look to the banks, that we see a growing number of non-banks or a very large big techs taking up either banking services or even a banking license stepping in, which will also impact the functioning of the financial system and the banks.
Understood. Yoav, I'm going to turn to you. I'm going to get to the digital shekel in a few minutes, and we'll talk about what Bank of Israel is doing. But you and the BOI do a lot of work with the BIS, and we have the BIS here, and they did fantastic presentations yesterday. I want to talk a little bit about Project Icebreaker. By the way, for those who don't know, the BIS has the best naming of projects of anything out there, and I think all of us are very curious how they come up with the names, and I should have asked Cecilia how. Maybe she's here, and I'll ask her. But Project Icebreaker is between Israel, Norway, Sweden, and one of the things that's interesting about it, it's cross-border retail CBDC. We've talked a lot about cross-border wholesale CBDC. We talked about that last night. There could be a use case for it. That's certainly where a lot of the attention is in the US right now from the Federal Reserve and the New York Fed. But what were your learnings from that project on cross-border retail?
Thank you, Josh. First of all, let me say it's really a pleasure to be here, although virtually you guys are having an amazing conference. I really wish I could have been there physically. Unfortunately, the circumstances did not enable that. But, you know, when times are hard as they are now in Israel, people should be focusing on things they love to do. And for me, discussing CBDCs with you, obviously with Evelien, whose project we follow so closely and we learn so much from, is definitely something enjoyable. So thanks for the opportunity. Talking about Project Icebreaker, which is really an amazing experience. I think Cecilia said yesterday that the role of the BIS is to demonstrate the art of the possible. I may not be quoting exactly. And I think in Project Icebreaker, we demonstrated that it is possible, and we demonstrated it, I think for the first time, that retail CBDCs could be used for cross-border payments, with CBDCs actually being used end-to-end, all the way from a payer in country A to a payee in country B. And this is very different from some of these wholesale projects, which you mentioned, where CBDCs are being traded among the banks, but the end user actually remains exposed to her bank's credit risk or to the level of competition in the local banking system, and et cetera. And also the fact that CBDCs are being used end-to-end and that the model actually demonstrated how transactions could be nearly atomic completely abolishes the risks that are inherent in correspondent banking as we know it today. Another interesting feature of Project Icebreaker was that it could really support competition in the cross-border space because it did disentangle between the service provision, the payment of the service of payment provision, and the service of FX conversion. So it could really support competition in the cross-border space. But I think really that maybe the most important feature is that the system which was suggested in Icebreaker is a hub and spoke system. And that means that only minimal adjustments are required for any country, any local system that would need to connect to that ecosystem. And that actually has a potential for connecting every CBDC and every faster payment system in the world to an ecosystem of cross-border payments. And this is opposed to some of the solutions that we're seeing in the cross-border space today, which in my view actually threaten to create regional walled gardens, where some payment systems would connect to others and some would remain excluded. Just to give an example, I think we should aim for cross-border CBDCs to develop kind of in a similar way to how national and international telephone systems have developed, for example. You know, no matter where you are and no matter where you want to call, all you need to do is enter a 1, 2, or 3 digit country code and a 3-digit area code and 7 or 8 digits. And, you know, it's the same no matter from where, no matter where you are calling. Whereas, you know, another end game could be that we would end up similar to where international trade has ended up, where you have all of these regional blocks and geopolitical blocks, and it's easier to trade from one country to another than to a third country. I think that could actually lead us once again to walled gardens in payments. And therefore, I think we should be looking more thoroughly into the model similar to that was suggested in Icebreaker. It's obviously much more difficult to set standards for payments than it is to making phone calls. And Cecilia mentioned that yesterday. And of course, there's this whole thing about AML policies that needs to be considered. But I really hope, and there's definitely a lot of research and work that needs to be done before a model like Icebreaker could become operational. But I really very much hope, and this is also coming from, from the position of a small and open economy, that there would be some kind of international collaboration that would form this kind of model and do some more work for this into the future.
And I mean, Yoav, that is one reason we're hosting this conference, to talk about issues just like that. What should these standards be? Who should manage them? And I guess I want to ask you as a follow-up on that, you talked about hub and spoke. The natural question for me, and we'll do workshops this afternoon, is who manages the hub? I mean, that seems to be the big question here. IMF obviously talked yesterday, Tobias talked about the ideas for the hub, but they are not operational in that sense. So who would manage the hub based on what you've learned so far? And there's not official Bank of Israel policy on who should manage the hub. I'm just curious for your thoughts.
Practically, the Bank of Israel tech people have built the hub, but that was, of course, the experimental hub in the project. And the nice thing about doing an experimental project as opposed to doing something in real life is that you could leave some topics out of scope. And indeed, this very big question of who would be managing such a hub, or the whole government discussion about this, was not discussed during the project. But I think we mentioned several ideas. You could think of something of a public sector nature, some kind of institution like maybe the IMF or the BIS of another sort of international institution. You can think of some kind of a private sector collaboration, a SWIFT style sort of, and you can even maybe think of all sorts of distributed models. So there's definitely a lot of thinking to do about that. What would be the most efficient model for that? But we are seeing, other systems in the world that are managing to be managed and organized with some kind of international arrangement that manages them. But definitely, as I said, there's much work that needs to be done in order to push this through. Thinking about this question is definitely part of this work that needs to be done.
I agree. I think it's something we're going to try to take forward and even make progress on today, but something we all have to make progress on in the months and years ahead. I'm going to ask you one more question about a BIS project before I go back to Evelien. Project Sela, and I'm going to get very technical as if we haven't been technical enough, but I think this is an important distinction that often gets confused. This was something you did with HKMA, Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and it was all about distribution models in which the CBDC intermediaries, we call them access enablers in the project, do not need to hold CBDC at any point. But if the end user, and I was really interested in this in the report, wants to fund their CBDC wallet against the bank account, the bank would transfer the CBDC from its wallet to theirs. And the reason I raise that is because in that situation, it means the commercial bank needs to hold retail CBDC to make sure the customer has what they need, in theory, if I understand that right. And I guess the question it raises for me when I'm reading that is, are we blurring the distinction then between what is a wholesale CBDC and what is a retail CBDC when you're asking the commercial banks to hold large amounts of this? Does that question make sense?
Yes, it does. And the short answer to this question is yes. But let me go back a bit and maybe give the fundamentals for this answer. We all agree that one important design feature of CBDCs is interoperability against other types of money. If I can quote, important report of the BIS and the 7 central banks from 2020 about the core principles for CBDCs, they said that the system needs to offer sufficient interaction mechanisms with private sector digital payment systems and arrangements to allow easy flow of funds between systems. So funds need to flow very easily between, for example, your commercial bank account and your CBDC wallet or account or whatever. Now, let's think how this could work. So when an end user wants to exchange CBDC against a commercial bank deposit, by essence, what she's doing, she's actually exchanging a central bank liability against a commercial bank liability. So there needs to be some kinds of reconciliation between the commercial bank and the central bank. And that, as we all know, usually takes place on RTGS systems. But these systems, as we also know, they usually do not work 24/7. Then we would want interoperability 24/7, and they are not fit for low value and high frequency transactions as would be required for these CBDC funding and defunding operations. So in Sela, we were looking for a way to actually solve this issue, which threatens to limit the interoperability between CBDC and deposits, the fact that you don't have a good system to reconcile between the commercial bank and the central bank. And there can be many ways to solve this. The ECB, for example, for the best of my knowledge, in the prototyping exercise, suggested something like a digital euro dedicated cash account. This was one version of this was considered in Sela. But eventually, our analysis in Project Stella concluded that the best way to allow this interoperability is actually to have commercial banks hold some chunk of their reserves with the central bank in the form of retail CBDC. And then the funding operation will actually take the form of a simple, as you said, transfer between the commercial bank and wallets and the users' wallets. And that actually got us to think that our problem was that the systems that we use today to record central bank liabilities with commercial banks does not work 24/7, and it's not for high frequency and etc. And if we build retail CBDCs, we by definition are building a system that records central bank liabilities to everyone, not only to banks, that works 24/7, obviously, and that can support low value and high frequency transactions, and therefore most probably could also be able to be adapted to allow low frequency and high volume transactions. So if we build such a great system that can do everything that the old system can do, why should we actually have, in the long run, two systems? Why should we have both a wholesale or an RTGS system? And actually, I like to quote Fabio Panetta on that, on saying that wholesale CBDCs are really nothing more than just modernizing the RTGS systems that we have today. So why should we, in the long-term future, why should we have two systems for recording central bank digital liabilities, wholesale and retail, and we would always have to take care of the liquidity moving from one system to another, and etc. So maybe in the long term, what we need to think about is a system that can record central bank liabilities for everyone, and that system can serve individuals, merchants, financial institutions, governments, each, of course, with the relevant settings, because there would be different settings for limits. Of course, you cannot limit a commercial bank like you can limit an individual, different settings for privacy, for security, but we may come up with a more efficient result than developing these two systems separately into the future. So yes, I at least am starting to think that we should stop distinguishing between wholesale CBDCs and retail CBDCs. We have also wholesale CBDCs already, we have RTGS systems, and into the future, maybe we need to think about how we put all of these central bank digital liabilities in one system that can support all sorts of users and all sorts of use cases.
Okay, that's helpful. I'm also a believer that wholesale CBDC is a poorly named type for what it actually is and has created a lot of confusion. But Evelien, let me come back to you on that front, because we hear a lot from the ECB on retail CBDC, and to use the name that may be confusing, but what is happening on the wholesale research side, or do you distinguish it as much as we kind of do in the typology and the research on the two?
Yes, we do. We do make a difference, and let me also come back to what was just said. So what we always say is that in Europe we already have a wholesale CBDC, because we have Target 2, which works as a wholesale CBDC. The only thing that we are currently doing, and we have started with that work in the course of this year, is to have experiments to see whether DLT technology might help us to serve other use cases. And to the point of Jeff on funding and defunding actually of the retail CBDC, we think our system, Target 2, is perfectly capable of doing so, indeed, with a dedicated cash account. It's the same as we do in order to facilitate instant payments. And actually, we don't see any big challenge. Of course, we need to make some adjustments in order to connect it to the settlement engine for the retail CBDC. But the problems that Jeff described that they have experienced is not what we foresee. And for us, there's a clear distinction. In retail CBDC are owned by the end user, so either a merchant or a consumer, and not by a bank. So the funding and the defunding in our model would be done from Target 2, and that could be in the form of a dedicated cash account in order to facilitate it 24/7. And that means that it is indeed an exchange in central bank money, but it's not that we will give retail CBDC to banks. So we found a slightly different solution than that was just suggested.
That's helpful. No, and this is what Cecilia was also talking about yesterday, of different answers for different types of economies and countries, and then learning from the prototypes and the pilot projects and understanding what works or doesn't work in an individual situation. Evelien, I want to talk about privacy. It's a core theme of the conference. It's obviously a core topic anytime we talk about CBDC issues. And I want to talk about specifically in the context of the digital euro, because it seems to me the answers you are working on privacy and anonymity could have a huge standard-setting effect and an influence, not just in the Eurozone, but across economies who will look at what you're doing and say, can we model off that? So what can you tell us about how you think about the issue, what technological solutions you're bringing to bear so far?
Yeah. Thank you for this question, because indeed privacy is of big importance. We also get it back when we do consultations that this is high on the list of concerns. I think we need to distinguish two types or two views on privacy. The first one is the end-to-end privacy of a payment solution that I as a consumer can trust, or a merchant for that reason. So that is really from when I do a payment for myself, through an intermediary, through a settlement engine, and then back to the payer, the payee, and its bank. And there we actually have the online digital euro, where it has been said also in the draft legislation, because in the end the level of privacy needs to be defined by the legislator. And the legislator has said that for the online, it would follow the same AML-CFT rules as another online payment methods. That means that intermediaries have access to the data for doing AML-CFT checks. Then we have also thinking on the offline digital euro, which will be a different setup, because it would mean that you will hold your digital euros in a secure element, so be either on your phone or on a specific card, and you can do an offline transaction between the two devices. There, the level of privacy is very close to the level of privacy that you can have with cash, as you can imagine, because there's not a network where the transaction needs to be processed on. It's just between the two devices the transaction is modeled. So that's on the end-to-end privacy. And there are debates, but that's, as I said, for the legislator, whether there could be exceptions for lower value transactions. So let's see what the discussion will bring there going forward. Then the other element which people bring a lot is the visibility that the central bank would have on the transactions that they would do. And there actually we propose to have a much higher level of privacy than people currently have. So if you currently do an online transaction, not only your bank get the full access to your data, but also the processors in between have a full access to your data. For the Euro system, we will design the system in a way that we will not be able to connect the transaction data to a private individual. So we will see a transaction, but we will not know that it's a transaction between myself and my daughter, for example. So that's where we are. We have been experimenting already in the prototyping with some privacy enhancing techniques. We did some work on UTXO, a very technical term, and we are further working on that in the next phase. And as I said, also on the sourcing that we will do will also inform us on the final technology choices that we would choose in order to achieve the level of privacy that we were just talking about.
And when you think about the level of privacy, are you exploring this tiering we see other central banks do of, low euro amount under 100 or 500 euros where there's less compliance asked for? Is this something you're considering? We see central banks who are further along in the pilot and launch adopting a 3-tier or 4-tier system.
Yeah, we have been thinking about that, but as I said, it's not the ECB that will make this call. So this is really the legislator that need to agree on such a tiering. Currently, in the current draft proposal, it's not in. So let's see if this changes during the discussion on the legislative debate.
One other design question for you, Yoav, before I come back to you, but Evelien, on just the user experience, I think there's a lot of misconception. You mentioned intermediaries. People, think, and we've talked about this a lot in the conference, that you're going to have a direct relation with your central bank. That's not the case. That's why intermediaries are there. But walk us through in your imagination. I open up my phone. I'm in the Eurozone. I have my Santander banking app. And do I have two tabs? Is there a digital euro tab? Is there my commercial banking liability? Am I transferring between the two? Is that how you think about it?
Well, we have said that there are actually three ways that you have access to your digital euros. So one would be indeed that it's integrated in your banking app. That's one solution. The other one is that we have said that it should also be possible to pay with a card. So that is the second way. And the third thing is that we will also make sure that there is a digital euro app issued by the euro system. So there are actually three ways to get access to the digital euro. Then on the user experience and how it would look like, there is, we want to make sure that the digital euro can be used in a similar way everywhere. And maybe when you're in the US, you might not be aware of how things work in Europe, but in Europe we have actually not one way to pay digitally with the digital euro. So with the euro, so there are like the international card schemes, that they are not accepted everywhere. And then you have more domestic solutions, which are quite often wage solutions, but often only target the national country. So then if you have a way to pay in, for example, I live in the Netherlands in the weekends, and during the week I work in Frankfurt, but my card from the Netherlands is not accepted in quite a number of shops in Frankfurt. So that's why we will work on this rulebook and this scheme so that we can make sure that there is a standard between the payer and the payee, which is a standard that we can ensure that a digital euro works like a banknote. If you get a means to pay from your bank in Italy, you travel to Germany, the merchant accepts the digital euro that you have and with your means of payment. Then in the context of this rulebook, we will also make sure that there's a harmonized experience so that the way you pay and how it looks the same, while we leave sufficient room for intermediaries to add value-added services and to make sure that it's up to the standards that they normally provide also to their customers.
Thank you. And so Yoav, back to you. How are you thinking about intermediaries then with the Digital Shekel project, and a chance for you to tell us the status of the Digital Shekel project as well?
Thank you. So yeah, our thinking about intermediaries all from the start of the project was that we need to create an open and competitive ecosystem more than the one that we have today in our payments landscape. Israel has a relatively concentrated financial system, not too many banks and not too many payment institutions. So our thinking initially was that we need to allow all sorts of entities, all sorts of institutions to serve as intermediaries in the CBDC ecosystem. This was actually once again demonstrated technically and legally. Its legal feasibility was also tested in Project Sela, where according to that vision, access enablers, as we call them there, or PSPs as we call them in the project, in the Digital Shekel project, do not need to be financial institutions in the sense that they do not need to ever hold not only their customers' funds, because their customers are holding CBDCs, which is a liability of the central bank, but they don't even need to hold any liquidity in order to support their customer payments or funding, because as I said earlier, this would be done via the bank. So your bank would actually be sending your CBDCs on your from their wallet to your wallet, and your PSP does not need to kind of touch the money at any point of time. We think that that sort of an ecosystem would significantly increase competition because it could allow all sorts of entities. You could think, for example, about retailers, about media providers, about utility providers, all sorts of entities that could allow end users to consume the Digital Shekel service or the Digital Shekel app from other entities. If you choose to, you can get that from your bank, or if you choose to, you can get it both from your bank and from another entity. But there could be all sorts of entities providing the intermediation service in the Digital Shekel space. So this is kind of our thinking about intermediaries.
And where are you standing right now on the project itself, the overall Digital Shekel project? What phase are you in, and what should we look for next from Bank of Israel?
So about almost a year ago now, our steering committee had kind of set up a timeline. One thing that's bad about looking at what the ECB is doing all the time is that they're working in a very ordinary manner. So there are timelines and there are programs and you know exactly what they're doing. So then our steering committee was also saying, okay, we need to set some kind of an interim target and an interim timeline. And right now, our timeline is that by the end of 2024, the steering committee expects to see some kind of what we call a design document. I guess conceptually, you can think about it as similar to the concept of the investigation phase that the ECB is doing. But of course, our project is much more modest in terms of resources. So our deliverable by the end of 2024 will probably be much less, detailed than what we've just seen from the ECB a couple of weeks ago. But the idea is to have some kind of a design document which will enable us, if we choose to at that point, to do some kind of an RFI to the ecosystem and to the industry, and also, to reflect both to ourselves internally and to the ecosystem externally what we think the digital shekel should look like. So what we're actually doing is that we've made a list of about 20, we call them work items, but you can think about 20 sort of like topics. So for example, the architecture, the topic of immediacy, privacy, of course, limits, interoperability, offline, all sorts of topics that, we are all in the CBDC space looking at, and we've made a list of them. And we cover each of them for a couple of months, and then we extract some decisions on each topic, and extract some requirements that could support these decisions and bring those to the steering committee to approve. It is clear to us that this process would have to be iterative, because if we're doing these things, by an order, so of course, if you talk about privacy, for example, before you studied your AML requirements, then of course you can't make all the decisions on privacy before you studied AML. If you talk about immediacy and finality, for example, before you made decisions regarding consumer protection. So once you go down to consumer protection, you may need to revisit your decisions regarding immediacy and finality, and et cetera, and et cetera. Two things that we've left to the end, actually, of this two-year program. One of them is cross-border. So there's no, there's no point of designing how this digital shekel would work cross-border before we see how this space develops internationally. And hopefully we will be seeing some direction from the international debate, in about a year's time, which would allow us to make some decisions on how the digital shekel could be interoperable with our other CBDC systems. And another topic that we left for the end is programmability, because this space is changing all of the time, and we really want to make sure that the decisions that we make on this topic would be as updated as possible to what we are seeing from around the world. Of course, a very important component of our strategy is to follow what goes on in other central banks and in the industry, and in this whole science of the new forms of money, and adopt as much as we can and follow as much as we can from what we see going on around the world.
Yoav, thank you. And I can't believe we came to day 2 of the conference since the first time I remember the word programmability has been mentioned. So I'm glad you raised that, an important topic on CBDCs that needs its own working group and session later in the day. Evelien, I want to go back to you and pick up on something Yoav said, because I think about it a lot with the digital euro, and it's about the influence the digital euro might have, the standard setting. Can you talk about the way you collaborate with other central banks? We know some of it's private, of course. The way you plan on sharing what you can technologically on the solutions over the next 2 years as you're in the preparation phase. Obviously the Bank of England is a few years behind you. They've committed, it looks like, to do a CBDC by the end of the decade. The Fed further behind that. We heard from the Bank of Japan yesterday. They're making good progress, we know, on the digital yen. But how do you think about coordinating with other central banks and standard setting in this space?
Thank you. I think it's very important, and it's a bit of a difficult situation. I think it was also mentioned by Joab, because on one hand, you want to design, or you need to design a digital euro or a digital currency, let's put it this way, for the needs that you have. And we know that the environments are slightly different per country. Also, the reasons to issue digital currencies differ a bit. So also how they look like might differ a bit. So that's on one side. So that is still in motion and still not defined, and we're still progressing. And then to discuss on how it should be interoperable and work together, it is a bit difficult if this is not. So it's a fine balance that we need to find, all of us. But having said that, we are very committed to this work. So we work in the context of the BIS, of course. We also have more bilateral interchanges with, I think, almost all major central banks to learn from experiences, to share also experiences. In the broadest sense, I think the whole project so far has been very open and transparent. So we have done a market study, which is the most technical part, I think, after the functional part at the beginning of this year, which was published. So the study itself, our thinking, but also the results of this study. And also going forward, we will continue to be open and publish as much as we can, because there is no intrinsic motivation why not to do so. What we do think is that it's important that the work on the international fora continues, even though with the caveats that I just gave. So, for example, the G7 public policy principles that were published in 2021 are guiding our work. We're also looking very closely to the work the IMF has done. So we welcomed very much the recent published IMF Cbdc handbook. If we look to the standard setting going forward, there are a couple of things that we find very important. And the first one that would not surprise you is the privacy of the solution. Because if we would have interoperability between two solutions which have a very different level of privacy, that might be a problem. The strong resilience and security of the solution is extremely important. People should not be worried about that. It should always work. It should always be safe. And last but not least, it should do no harm to international and monetary financial system. So those are the things that we also in these exchanges bring forward.
Evelien, thank you. And you mentioned earlier in one of your answers consultations, and I just want to raise for the group here, I think the ECB has done a fantastic job, and it's a model about public communication as much as possible, with understanding that things are in process with citizens about what's happening. This is often not a strength of central banks, to be quite honest. I actually think the ECB has more muscle memory on this, having introduced the euro itself 20 years ago, than a lot of central banks. You know, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve have not been used to recent history, as most central banks, of thinking about communicating that people need to use a product. And so I give a lot of credit to the ECB on that front. Obviously, a lot more work to do. We have about 4 minutes left, and I want to get to the audience, so we can probably do 1 or 2 questions. I think we'll have a mic in the back. So 1 or 2, raise your hands, and please, anyone. I have a lot of questions left, but I want to give a chance. Yes, sir, let's get you a mic.
Thank you very much. Gonzalo Santamaria from Currency Research. Evelien, with the ongoing research and preparation of the euro, what incentive will the actual users have to, with the choices of payments that they have? So what will be the biggest benefit for a user to choose the digital euro over all the other payments that we have currently? I live in Spain, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One thing that is always nice and we find very important, because the digital euro is a public good, is that it's free for its basic use. So I think that's a strength. I think another point is very important, is that it's a pan-European solution. So you're from Spain, you probably work a lot with Bizum. I'm from the Netherlands. We work a lot with Ideal. We love to work with that. We can share. Can do when we have had a dinner. We can share the bill digitally, and everybody's happy. But I can't do this with my European colleagues here in Germany, because we all work with different solutions. So this fact that you, as with a banknote, can trust that you can pay everywhere, I think is very important. So therefore, the legislative proposal, which has a legal tender in it, so that means that there is it supports the wide accessibility and usability of the digital euro. So it means that if you go to your bank, your payment service provider, you will be able to get a digital euro. And on the other side, if you go to a merchant that accepts digital payments, you can trust that he will also accept digital payments. We think these are very important elements that will make people happy to use the digital euro, the level of privacy, the offline solution that is currently not existent, but giving a high level of privacy in a digital environment are amongst the things that we think can really incentivize people to start using it. But I want to say that the digital euro just wants to be another option. So there is no pressure on anybody to use the digital euro. It's just an additional option next to cash and to private means of payments.
Thank you, Evelien. This is something we've talked about a lot of. Central banks have to make it an attractive option, but not so attractive and complementary. So it's a balance being struck of what they're introducing in a way that hasn't really been done before. So it is a new challenge for central banks, I think, in many respects. Let me get one more audience question in before we finish. Yes, sir, in the back.
Good morning. My question is primarily for Yoav. My name is Tristan Toma, and you had mentioned the transactionability of the token from the Bank of Israel to the user's wallet utilizing intermediaries as what I assume are payment processors. So my question is, do you have already a vision or proposal of the relationship of the token to the wallet that the user will own, the relationship of that wallet to the Bank of Israel, and the liability of the token to the wallet of the user?
Thank you. I don't think I ever used the word token, so let me emphasize that we're trying to be as technologically agnostic as possible at this point. I think the relationship would be that the end user would be holding a wallet which would be provided by their PSP, okay? But that wallet would actually be connected to some kind of recording system operated by the core Cbdc system. So that wallet would actually reflect at every point of time how much Cbdc the end user has on the central bank, core system. And then once making such a funding operation, as I mentioned earlier, so there would be CbdCs flowing from the commercial bank's wallet to the end user's wallet in that sense. Whether it would be a token-based system or an account-based system or something in between, which seems to be most reasonable if you ask me at this point of time. But in terms of how that would exactly work technologically, we have a general architecture in mind. We've demonstrated that in Project Sela, actually. You can read the report there. We're adopting a lot of the architecture in Sela into our current architectural work here at the Digital Shekel project. But we haven't, and I don't think that we will be in the very near future be making very concise technological decisions about, whether it would be a token-based or account-based system, etc. I hope I answered the question.
Yoav, thank you for raising that, because one thing my colleague Ananya and I talk about a lot is there just has to be a clarity on terms in this space, and we get confusing ourselves with token account in the Cbdc realm. We talked about wholesale retail earlier. It's some work we're going to try to do at the Atlantic Council going forward. Final lightning round question from me for you both, and it's a difficult one, but you only have a minute each to answer, and I apologize for that. And Yoav, I'll start with you, and Evelien, I'll give you the final word. What is the single biggest obstacle in your mind to developing a Cbdc? Not launching one. I understand that's a legislative and a political decision that has to be made, but the development on the technological side. Yoav.
I'm not sure, I am not a technologist, so I cannot say that the biggest challenge is at the technological, front. I think the biggest challenge would be that at some point we would need to actually decide that we are able to decide on a design that will need to last for, decades forward. And it's so hard to imagine what would be the stance of our payment ecosystem and what our economy would be requiring decades forward. We're all just able to imagine the way payments, the way trade flows, the way the economy works today, but we need to design something that will be adopted maybe in 5, 10, I don't know how many years, but will be used then at least hopefully 20, 30, 40 years forward. And who could have imagined 30 years ago how we would be consuming, for example, digital content these days. So I really think this is our biggest challenge, how to be, first of all, designing something that would cater to to the end user in terms of the inclusion ideas that we all have. So something that would be very simple to be used for anyone, but something that could also be used decades forward into the economy, which is hard for us to imagine.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Future-proofing money is something we talk about a lot in this context. Evelien, over to you.
Well, I'm very happy with the comment that Joab made, because then I don't need to make it and I can make 2 others. So actually I would like to raise 2 things on top what was said, because I recognize and I underwrite that very much as well. I think there are 2 challenges. One, if you really look to more technological side, the offline digital euro or the offline solution is quite a technological challenge that we see ahead of us. So that is one. And the other one would be the scale. So because of the digital euro, it looks like that it will become a legal tender. So that means that if we roll it out, it needs to be in one go, like with the banknotes. Everybody needs to be in Europe needs to be able to pay and to get paid with the digital euro. So all merchants need to be ready, all banks need to be ready, the euro system needs to be ready. That will be quite an operation.
I think offline is an excellent note to end on. One of the big challenges we will talk about in the working groups today. Evelien, Yoav, thank you both so much. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Evelien Witlox, Yoav Sofer today. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.